This session is Building International Coalitions to Scale Defense. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for turning out. 8:30 a.m. after the legendary RSA parties that go on into the wee hours of the night. You are the battle warriors of cyber for turning up and staying at it. I am privileged to have some of our dear friends and partners from the international community here. So with me, I have Felicity Oswald, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the National Cybersecurity Center, NCSC, out of GCHQ, so here from the UK. I also have Rita Erfurt, Threat Intelligence Senior Executive from the Australian Cybersecurity Center from the ASD. And then on the far end, Sammy Curry, who is the head of CSE, the Canadian Cybersecurity Establishment. We have such an amazing partnership across the Five Eyes where for decades we've worked together in the sharing of intelligence and threats, and that partnership has grown up not only in the cybersecurity arena, but all threats. And really that's where we have a lineage of years and years of working the most sensitive missions to threats going all the way back to the World War, where our nations were at threat across the globe, and we found that we're stronger together. And that partnership has continued into cybersecurity, where now we see these global threats coming at us. And today we'll talk about ransomware, and especially the ransomware threat, because that's a scourge affecting all of us, right? It hits all of our nations. And the good news, what I hope you leave here today, is understanding that our respective governments, and actually many more, are in this together to make maximum use of what we know, what we can do, and how we can collaborate to make the space better. So with that, let me jump straight into some of the discussion, and we'll try to save about 5 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So if there's something we don't hit that you'd really like to hit us with, we'll try to save that time as well. So I'd really like to start the conversation with a baseline understanding of the ransomware threat and have each of the panelists come through and talk about really how it's impacting their nation specifically. So Felicity, you want to lead?
Thank you so much, and thank you, Rob and RSA, for having me and the team today. It's my first time at RSA, and it's genuinely like Cyber Disneyland, including with the first timers badge, which I last had at Disneyland. But thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It won't be unsurprising to any of you that for the UK, ransomware is our most acute threat. We are seeing it everywhere, and it's not just a crime issue or a cyber issue. It's a public safety issue, it's a prosperity issue, and it's absolutely a national security issue. For us, it's pervasive, so it's lucrative and seemingly all too easy. It's pernicious too. So the effects can be devastating for an organisation and the people that depend on the services or the businesses that organisation serves. Our healthcare, our local public services, our education, as well as businesses, large and small, are all impacted by ransomware. And so it's indiscriminate and it's unjust in terms of the impact it has. And for us, it's getting worse. You don't have to be highly skilled to hire a ransomware attack surface or attack methodology, and you can make thousands, hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of dollars. So any actor can deploy ransomware. So this has broadened and deepened the threat. And finally, the last thing I'd say is that for the UK, our assessment is that some ransomware actors at least are likely not just to be directed by profit, but actually being directed or encouraged even by hostile state actors. So it's a really serious threat that for a long time we've seen just through the money lens. It's not just that anymore for us.
Outstanding. All right, Rita,
Yeah.
Is it any different in Australia?
Unsurprisingly, it's not, and I think that'll probably be the case for most technologically advanced countries or those where it's quite financially prosperous. So very similar situation in Australia. We always say ransomware, it's prolific, it's overt, it's both opportunistic and targeted. I don't think there's any sector of the Australian economy where we can say, look, you are not a threat from ransomware. When it comes to, we sort of holistically look at our cybersecurity environment, each year, and we put together a holistic threat report, and in that we sort of draw together everything that's happened over the course of that year. And when we look at that information, we continue to assess that ransomware is the most destructive form of cybercrime that's impacting Australia. And that is because some of the lasting impacts that ransomware has on our community, and I think you touched on that perfectly. It's not just about the organisation or the business that has been subject to that attack. It is about the employees, it is about the community, and especially we're seeing a lot of that sort of double extortion method with ransomware as well. So, you know, that worst case scenario, your systems are encrypted and your data's been thieved. And in that instance, we had a couple of fairly significant data breaches as well. Those have lasting impacts on the community, and we had instances last year where very sensitive data was leaked online about Australians. And that really has that sort of longer term impact on the community, and it really starts to erode some of the confidence in that digital economy as well, which is incredibly necessary for our prosperity. I guess from a specific Australian perspective as well, it's not just about us as a nation, you know, it extends far beyond our shores. That collaboration piece is necessary and extremely beneficial. And from an Australian perspective, and that within our Pacific region, we also have that responsibility to provide advice and assistance to our Pacific countries, our neighbours in the region. And that is all about trying to uplift our cybersecurity posture within the region and build a really resilient sort of Pacific nation as well.
Outstanding. And Sammy, how about in Canada?
Thanks, Rob, for the opportunity. Canada isn't any different than my three colleagues here. It's the number one threat affecting Canadian and Canadian businesses. And actually, last October, we issued our National Cyber Threat Assessment, and in it, we've identified that ransomware continues and will continue to be, for the foreseeable future, the number one threat that affect Canadian and Canadian businesses. It's such an acute threat that there was an open letter signed by 4 ministers, so 4 cabinet ministers, to Canadians to pay attention to sort of the advice and guidance that we put out and to take the threat very seriously. We've had, like many of my colleagues, we've been inflicted with a number of ransomware incidents in Canada, many of them, you know, affecting services to citizens. The most acute one was bringing down the entire healthcare system of a province, and that has, has an impact on the citizens of Newfoundland to get healthcare services for a number of weeks. So that is the seriousness of the threat that ransomware poses. The actors have, no scruples or no morals, and they went after a children's hospital, they went after schools, and we continue to deal with it from that perspective in Canada.
So as we have this serious, significant threat, all of us are pushing into national strategies, right? How are we going to do this? And while you heard the threat is the same across all the nations, there are slight differences in our national strategies. For the recent US national strategy, 4 parts in the ransomware section were called out. Excuse me. The first is we will investigate ransomware crimes using law enforcement and other authorities to disrupt the ransomware infrastructure. Second big area of focus is improving critical infrastructure to withstand those ransomware attacks. The third is addressing the abuses of virtual currency to launder ransomware payments. And the fourth is leveraging the international cooperation to disrupt the ransomware ecosystem, right? Hence this and other collaborative efforts we have underway. So that's kind of where the US thinks about how we get after the ransomware problem. Felicity?
So in the UK, we published our most recent cyber strategy in December 21, so we're 18 months or so in. For the first time, it was a whole of cyber strategy. So we previously had cybersecurity strategies that looked very much at just cyber defense. And for the first time, we took the step to go whole of cyber. And I know that's not every nation's approach, but for us, including offensive cyber and everything that comes with that as part of that strategy was a really important stance for us. The strategy, unsurprisingly, has 5 pillars. Pillars is a common approach, I know. So if I can get them all right, in the right order. So ecosystem, which for us is about growth and skills. We've got one on technology, the resilient and prosperous society, the future of our, the future of our global relationships and taking global leadership, And then finally on detecting and disrupting our adversaries. So that's our broad approach to all cyber threats, and that's really the approach we're taking to ransomware too. So a holistic approach to the whole of the tackling of the threat. One of the things that, so our parent department, as you mentioned, Rob, is GCHQ, so the SIGINT agency for the UK. And one of the things we talk about a lot in GCHQ is the importance of having a mix of minds. And that goes back to our history in Bletchley and before that as well, in terms of bringing all sorts of people together with different skills and backgrounds and approaches to really solve the toughest problems. And it's that approach that we're bringing to ransomware. So you can't just tackle it as a single crime or as a cyber problem. You have to take it from really every stance.
Yeah, I also appreciate the UK being very explicit about the use of cyber power, right? And that is all elements of cyber power, to include the recently unveiled NCF and their strategy. So I think this community understands that. I think a focus of our activity is not to be passive and let criminals just continue to have opportunities to come at critical infrastructure, our businesses, our government, without being disrupted. And so the idea that we're going to introduce friction, it is a piece of the U.S. strategy as well. You don't hear it called out explicitly in the ransomware section, but the idea that we will do campaigns that try to add friction and contest that adversarial action. So well aligned.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
I think, speaking of being well aligned, so from an Australian perspective, we're actually just going through the motions of updating our cybersecurity strategy, and that new strategy is going to take us from 2023 through to 2030, and the overarching goal of that strategy is to make Australia the most secure place to connect online. So without going into sort of the details that are still being worked out within that strategy, what I will say is that the strategies that come from our international partners, I think there will be alignment there, because I think from an international perspective, we are very much in agreement of what does our cybersecurity situation look like and what methods do we need to undertake in order to tackle it and bring that, get a lot of cyber resilience across the board, across all of our nations. So we certainly look at what everybody else is doing in that space, what's unique about our own situation, and sort of pull all that together. But there's always, I think, going to be significant alignment because we are all working within the same cyber ecosystem.
Great. Thanks, Rita. Sammy.
Thanks. So, looking at we keep saying at the Cyber Center is our mantra is security through collaboration. So that is the premise of how do we work the cybersecurity field in Canada, starting with our closest partner in government. That's where we start. Our cyber strategy was written in 2018, and we felt that it needs a refresh. So it is currently being refreshed, and we hope to have it ready maybe by the summer of this year. So I don't know, May, June, somewhere around that time frame. We want to get it right, and of course being inspired by the US and the UK that already published their cyber strategy. It's all about partnership. We don't have mandatory incident reporting, so as a result, it's all about convincing those victims to reach out and share with us the details so that we can publish them and in an anonymous way and get others to pay attention to what is the threat as we see it. That continues to be the number one challenge is information sharing with the Cyber Center. On the international scene, the fact that the four of us are here speaks to the strength of the partnership, but it goes beyond also the four of us and building additional partnerships with international partners so that we get to participate in global event and share more of our knowledge about the threat actors. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the other half of the organization also has an intelligence mission, and we learn a lot through that. And likewise, we also have the authority to carry out cyber operations and to impose a cost on those actors. And we have used those authorities in the past. So there is a number of vehicles, everything from public to very, very, I would say, discreet. But the goal is to make a dent in the ransomware ecosystem.
Good. So I think the thing you should take away from this is we all speak the same language across these four chairs. Maybe with different accents, but it all comes together in a pretty well-aligned way. But Sammy just hit on a big part, which is, it is broader than these four nations or even the Five Eyes nations. we also have a vested interest in a lot of other partner countries. So Rita, you know, our superpower often is that SIGINT combined with the technical capabilities of these agencies. You want to talk a little bit about the partnerships you've set up to utilize that?
Absolutely, and I think we've got domestic and sort of international partnerships that address exactly what you're describing there. I think part of what makes ASD and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, which is part of ASD, really unique is that we, even internally within our organisation, we've got our intelligence, we've got our security, and we've got operational functions. So that gives us a lot of power when it comes to sort of driving different campaigns. We also have a joint standing operation with our law enforcement partners, and when we talk specifically about ransomware and counter ransomware, what that joint standing operation does is it means on a day-to-day basis we are actually sitting side by side with law enforcement, with our Australian Federal Police colleagues, and we are working on what are our priorities, what do they look like for each of our organisations, what are our operations, and we have a very similar function as well. We're doing a lot of operations. What do those operations look like? What are the lines of effort? How do we deconflict on these, and how do we ensure that we're driving forward together? So bringing those intelligence and those law enforcement functions into the same picture. But internationally, probably really want to touch on the Counter Ransomware Initiative, which is led out of the White House, and the International Counter Ransomware Task Force. That task force is currently being led by Australia, so Australia is the chair, or the co-award body of that task force. And I think, and while that task force and those initiatives are still quite new, I think what's incredible about it is there are 37 countries or 37 governments around the world who have said we want to be part of this task force because we recognise that ransomware is an issue that we need to collaborate on from an international perspective. And the purpose of that task force is to look across each of those 37 nations and say, how can all those different nations uniquely contribute? How can we draw all that expertise together? What are our best practices? What are our frameworks that we can utilise to really get the jump and to get ahead of that ransomware issue? And I think that really speaks to that international collaboration and how incredibly important it is in this particular field.
So every day, we out of these cryptologic agencies are sharing threat information, selectors, operations, tactics with more than 37 nations around the globe. It's having a real impact. I've seen specifically ransomware events prevented, activities disrupted, a big focus on the infrastructure, the actors, the tradecraft, and then especially getting that out to industry and the folks who can operationalize it. So Sammy, we've done some joint advisories that have had some ransomware focus as well. In 2022, we did a joint advisory calling out some malicious activity by the IRGC. So our Iranian actors who are very, very active in critical infrastructure ransomware, healthcare even. From your standpoint, what is that multi-nation, multi-organization joint advisory? What kind of message does that send, and how is it useful or not useful?
The punchline is it's super useful, and it's extremely powerful to have these joint advisories. We share a lot in common. We share the threat. We share the similar threats. But I would say also between Canada and the US, we share a huge border. And we have critical infrastructure that spans both borders. So it's extremely helpful when we put out advisory that they line up and that we communicate the same messages. So resources are stretched on both sides and across the community. So whenever there's an opportunity to align messages and use them in a constructive way or an amplifying way, those documents are very well received, and when we put them out, we amplify them. Sometimes we translate them in French, but at the same time, it's something that the community pays attention to when they see that 4, 5, 6 SEALs are supportive of a document. So for us, it's important to continue to go down that path and to continue to look for these partnerships in a public way, be it on stage here or putting out some documentation with the SEALs of the agencies.
Yeah, so in the US, you'll see CISA, FBI, NSA, all jointly, sealing things, often with international partners. And I think one of the big things that we've found is internationally, you know, there is sometimes the pressure for data localization, balkanization. When we get this kind of collaborative engagement across different nations, it sends a totally different signal about the intent and the importance.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate all of the effort. It takes a lot to clear through the lawyers of many different countries and many different organizations, but I do think it's well worth it. So Felicity, let me turn to you for a second and ask, in those advisories, we're often releasing tools and tradecraft, but even after they're exposed, these ransomware actors often are still very persistent. What have you found is effective? What advice would you give to folks to combat ransomware from your point of view?
So I think we've heard and colleagues have touched on the importance of working together both internationally but also across our own governments and with private sectors, and I think that is really borne out in the response to ransomware actors. So we use all sorts of tools in the UK, as I know colleagues do as well. So I think a combination of tackling the criminals, and that's the responsibility of law enforcement and government, of course, but also building resilience. So to give you two quick examples, Rob, if I may. First, the work the US and the UK did together to jointly sanction 7 cyber criminals back in February, so the 7 individuals who are linked to Conti and Ryuk. That was a really important step. The UK hasn't been in the sanctions game ourselves for a very long time, so it was an important step to do. And of course, that takes work and effort, but it's a really important signal. So increasingly doing things that tackle and call out the individual criminals, even if we can't reach them with traditional law enforcement methods. But then actually doubling down on our resilience too. So one of NCSC's roles is to provide what we call the Active Cyber Defence Programme for the UK, particularly around the public sector. One of the provisions in that is called PDNS, so Protective DNS. So that's an internet lookup for public sector in the UK. It's an opt-in service, though it's increasingly mandated across parts of our central government, so that we're actually preventing and getting in the way of some of those ransomware attacks to our public sector. So we're looking at how we roll that out increasingly, but I think it's important for central government agencies to be doing what they can to both demonstrate what's in the art of the possible, particularly for the public sector and those smaller public sector organisations that maybe don't have, a CISO or a big team to do their own IT security and cyber security. So actually providing some of those services centrally and rolling them out where we can and encouraging their use is vital. So I think it's got to be a combination. Unlike probably many of you in this room and many people at RSA, I'm not a software engineer, a mathematician, or a lawyer, and I think that probably means I'm in the minority. I'm a crime scientist by background. I was a criminologist, though I didn't finish my PhD, so apologies to anyone in the room who's also a criminologist. But I think in criminology, you're taught that, and you learn that actually crime is more than just about the individual criminal. It's about the system and the ecosystem they exist within and the cost and reward for those crimes. And I think that has to be the approach we tackle, both to tackle the criminals, but also to build resilience and target harden.
Great point. Rita, what about in Australia?
Yeah, I think there's actually, and you touched on it just then as well, so there's those strategic successes, and then there's obviously some of the operational successes that we have had in this space as well, and not specific to Australia, but a really good example of some of the collaboration that goes on within the community between our partners. Some of the operational successes that have been had against sort of Hive and Breach Forums and Genesis Marketplace. And Genesis Marketplace, 17 countries around the world were involved in those instances and making those arrests. And I think when we look at an ecosystem like that cybercrime ecosystem, that ransomware ecosystem, it's somewhat unpredictable and it's a bit uncertain. And now into that ecosystem, we're seeing ransomware as a services have been around for a while, and we've got different affiliates, and there's a lot of uncertainty in that. And I think if we need to see success in how do we tackle that ransomware issue, there's a lot that sits within that operational environment, and it's all about imposing cost. And how do we make life really hard for these cyber criminals? And I think when we tackle those from an operational perspective, when we tackle those enablers that underpin the ecosystem, we're able to sort of impact numerous sort of syndicates across the board. So that's also a really good example of how we as a coalition and a lot of different countries have come together in order to sort of, really impose cost on those cyber criminals.
Directionally, Sammy, where's ransomware going? Feeling good about it? You worried?
Short term, I think it's still going to be painful. So we still have a lot of work ahead of us, but I hope that these efforts starts to bear fruit, and we see it, medium-term plateau and then considerably go down after. We absolutely need to make a dent in this plague of ransomware and their very irresponsible behavior.
So how does, I'll throw this open to the panel, how does the safe haven problem fall into this, right? The actors who are untouchable in Russia or North Korea. Thoughts?
So I think you touched on that with some of the, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think the joint advisories is actually a really good example of deterrence as well. And when it comes to those safe havens, I think that's just one of those methods that we can have, and including sanctions and other sort of political methods as well, where we as a coalition stand together and allies say, we're not going to, we are going to call you out for this behaviour, and we're not going to condone the behaviours of those countries who do provide safe haven or who do encourage that kind of that kind of criminal activity. And I think that's so incredibly important, and the more that we do that, the more pressure that applies on those nations. And it just shows that as a coalition, we're not just going to stand by and allow that to continue to happen. So I think that's a really important part of that attribution process.
I would say our strategic advantage is the partnership that we have, not just on stage here, but behind the scene also amongst law enforcement. And the bigger that partnership is, so the 37 countries that Rita had spoken about or others, eventually those who profit from ransomware need to find an outlet to travel, to spend their money, or to enjoy their illicit gains. And that's when the law enforcement community can pounce. So I would say patience, but eventually we will get them.
The only thing I'd add is responsible cyber power, and that's got to start with the 37 in relation to ransomware, but increasingly that should be an expectation of all governments across the world to be responsible in their own actions and to ensure that they aren't allowing criminals to be safely harboured in their territories. Though all governments have responsibilities to look after their neighbours and their own citizens as well.
Yeah. Okay. So for the panel at large, how often does ransomware start or happen because of unpatched, unprotected systems that, just doing the basics would stop?
I come from an incident response background, so the vulnerabilities. So we've got the Essential 8, obviously, mitigation measures and we recommend, as a baseline you implement those, and there's different degrees of maturity that they can be implemented. And I will say, though, there's obviously no silver bullet that is going to protect anyone against cybersecurity incidents, but having the basics done really, really well is essential. Part of our Essential 8 is about patching operation systems, patching applications. And I think when we looked at sort of cyber incidents for Australia over the last year, there was a comment in there about, some of the most significant incidents that we had were due to inadequate patching. But also appreciate that, the vulnerabilities, I think last year there was a 25% increase in CVEs, which is extensive. And there's no way, as individuals, we can be on top of every single vulnerability, which is why it's so important that we, draw on the strengths of industry as well, who have got some really good insights into these vulnerabilities, and that we really work on that alert and advisory piece to the Australian public, and obviously respectfully to all other countries as well. And sort of that advisory, that information that we're able to put out allows people to make really good decisions around their own cybersecurity postures. But absolutely, there's a lot of incidents that take place purely because systems aren't adequately patched, and I'm not talking about just 0 days or new vulnerabilities. There's a lot of legacy in there as well, and just vulnerabilities that probably should have been patched a year ago. So it's absolutely an issue.
I would echo everything Rita said and add that there's a lot that can be prevented with basic cyber hygiene. But also, it's not just a technology problem, it's also an education problem, it's a human problem. We've seen some fairly sophisticated phishing attempts against whether it's the Canadian government or Canadian businesses that have led to, in some cases, ransomware. So it's how to educate users not to click on those links, how to educate users to be smart about, if it's too good to be true, then it isn't true, but absolutely it starts with some technology, raise the bar there, make it a bit more complex. They might go elsewhere, but also spend some time on the user side.
Okay, let me close with one last question, and then we'll go to your questions. So Felicity, we would be more secure
If we genuinely embraced a mix of minds in our cybersecurity community, thinking about backgrounds, thinking about skill sets, and ensuring that we've got industry and government people and charitable sector people working together.
Very good.
I'm going to copycat just ever so slightly. I'll say beginning of the question was, will we be more secure if we continue to be just as agile as our adversaries, and we draw on the expertise that exists between industry, academia, and government to really continue to push the boundaries of our cybersecurity environment.
Sammy?
Before I answer your question, I was in Belfast last week and on a 3R panel, so Russia, ransomware, and resilience. I added a twist at the end, which is the 3Rs: reduce, reuse, recycle. And so we would be more secure if people reduce that threat surface, if they reuse all of the good advice that we put out and pay attention to the advice that we put out, and also recycle the information in terms of information sharing with us so that we can make our communities a lot safer.
Outstanding. All right. So this is the part where we do audience participation. There's 2 mics. If you'd step up, and I would appreciate it if people would actually ask a question, not use the mics to make their own presentations. Brave soul going first. All right.
Hey, how you doing? Derek Johnson with SC Media. So I just have a question about, you talked about information sharing between your different nations, and I'm wondering how quickly you are able to share information with each other in the wake of an emerging cyber incident. So maybe something like a NotPetya type incident where speed is essential, where one nation may have some kind of information that is helpful. What kind of red tape or sharing protocols do you have to consider and work through before you can share that information?
All right, so how about I start, and then we'll
Sure.
add beyond that. So in the US, we have 24/7 op centers. So we are manned and equipped and able to recognize and then reach out. For this panel, the Five Eyes, exceptionally easy for us to share and pick up the phone, engage. We have protocols where if there's an intelligence report, it is automatically disseminated, and at the same time it's available to the US community, it's available to the folks on the stage. So impressively fast turnarounds. At the same time, myself and all my counterparts have each other in personal comms. And so if it's outside, our time zones are different, sometimes radically different. We're still able to reach out and just connect to say, hey, there's something I need to engage on. Often in the cybersecurity world, when you're talking about a rapid emergency, those are not the classified things, right? That's the stuff we see the internet on fire, and industry knows as much about it as we do. So the communication is often level setting what we know across our various op centers, across our various experts, and through our own relationships with various levels of industry. So, others?
So the only thing I'd add is that we have decades working together as SIGINT communities, and we bring that to bear in cybersecurity. It's quite unusual for people from our organisations, certain parent organisations, to be sitting on these stages, but actually the decades worth of Five Eyes relationship, I think, is a real strength. As we grow and build the cybersecurity community into as many countries as possible around the world, and we all mature, that's the challenge, is to keep up with that growth and ensure that all the right people in the room, whether they're other governments, whether they're nations who share critical national infrastructure with us, or whether they're private sector or third sector individuals. So I think for us, it's amazing to build on the strength that is the Five Eyes relationship. But going forward from that, we need to be ambitious, and we absolutely are.
And I'll tell a personal story and drag Sammy into this. I've been at NSA 34 years, almost 35. I think it was about 29 years ago that Sammy and I first met. And we've been counterparts across different organizations at least 4 times in my career. Yeah. So, you just don't get that level of connection and, just knowledge about people where you're comfortable, you're trusted, you're just engage, right? And there's
Yeah.
folks, Ian Levy just left NCSC, but he and I have had similar kinds of experience across the decades. And so that's really unusual, but we have this depth that really makes it easy and normal for us to be tight and connected.
Absolutely.
I guess the only extra thing to add is even at the working level, we have integrees from our agencies working completely embedded in the agencies of everybody on the panel. So even when something like that happens and there's a communications piece, a lot of the time we actually have people from our agencies who are literally sitting there who see these situations unfold, especially if there's a significant time difference. So I think that just adds that additional layer of connectivity.
So I'll add one additional unusual twist. We've talked about trust, I think, as being one of those key elements in a crisis that you can reach out and work. It's both a benefit and a curse that our cyber expertise bleeds out into industry, because what we're seeing is there are folks now in industry who know us, grew up in our system, speak the language, and also still have very active connectivity, so that if they see the problem first, they can reach out in a time-sensitive way to help. Thanks for the question. Thanks.
Hi, Andrew Campling. I work in Internet Standards. Some of the ways Internet standards are evolving, in my view, are likely to weaken cybersecurity, particularly in sort of enterprises and other large organizations. It's notable to me that you get very few governments participating in the standards development process. Some, but not all, of the Five Eyes are present. The next standards meeting, the IETF, is going to be in San Francisco in July. And I wondered whether perhaps a few more of those 37 countries could be persuaded to turn up, take part, and perhaps actually try and influence the standards development so it doesn't weaken our cyber defences. Thank you.
All right, please.
So NCSC in the UK, absolutely part of the standards conversation, and we have, Sammy mentioned a number of us were at Cyber UK, so our much smaller but still substantial cyber conference sponsored by and run by NCSC, we had it in Belfast this year. Standards was a big theme through those conversations, particularly in the international fora. So I think we do have a challenge with standards shaping, and we need to ensure that we are using our collective voice, not just our individual voice, because every vote counts in those environments.
So let me do a physical introduction. Yesterday morning, we had NSA people talking on standards here at RSA. Mike Boyle and Jess McKay are in the audience. I'm going to call them out. If you want to connect right after to talk about ideas, happy to have you introduced and engage. All right. Any additional questions? A couple popping up, please.
Good morning, Randy Pastana, Florida International University. This is a question that I noticed with regard to the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy, and I'm curious if it works with other countries and partners around the world. There was kind of an onus placed on the tech companies to move the responsibility away from the end user. Are there discussions in your country, and how are you working with the private sector to make this happen?
I can
Tim,
take. Sure.
start?
So it's important to raise the security bar across industry, and when CISA released the Secure by Default, Secure by Design, we were one of the co-signatory of that document. So we support everything that has come out in that publication. Sort of working with industry becomes a teamwork, and we have various marketplaces. In a sense, Canada's market is smaller than the US market. So as much as possible, when we add our voices or pull them together to put that pressure or to work with industry, this is when it's most effective. So I would say, yes, we support everything that was released in Secure by Default, Secure by Design, and working together as much as possible to amplify those messages to the tech companies.
Okay, final two questions.
Hi, I'm Beth Mondrell from Info Security Magazine. Sammy mentioned about mandatory reporting and how that is a really big challenge. So I just wanted to hear from the other panelists what their approach to mandatory reporting is and how important that is in the world of ransomware fighting.
So in the U.S., we've gotten legislation last year that's going to have mandatory breach reporting. CISA will be the U.S. government central repository for that, and they are underway with rulemaking to define the boundaries of the reporting, the timeliness, and the components that need to be reported. So that's a work in progress, and anybody that cares passionately about breach notifications should enter into the comment and rulemaking activity that CISA has underway.
So for the UK, it works slightly differently. NCSC is not a regulator, but we work really closely with the regulators in the relevant sectors, particularly as part of the critical national infrastructure. And our Information Commissioner's Office has an important role here as well. I think we need to balance, and the challenge for all of us is indeed balancing things that are mandatory with things that are encouraged. And we have to work with our regulators, but also with our private sector and public sector CNI as well.
Similar situation, so the ACSC is not a regulator either, but we do have some mandatory reporting requirements for critical infrastructure. What I would like to say though about the importance of that reporting is from an ACSC perspective, it is absolutely vital that we have as many organisations volunteer their incident reports as much as possible, because it allows us to draw together a really comprehensive threat picture, and then we utilise that threat picture to then re-advise the Australian community. So from our perspective, the more we can encourage people to report through to us on the incidents that they're experiencing, the better we can then turn that information around and advise the Australian community.
And I would say from a Canadian perspective, I mean, we have a very good track record of working, for example, with the telecommunications sector for over 10 years. The government has presented a bill, so it's going through Parliament right now, to make incident reporting mandatory for some federally regulated sectors. So not prejudging the outcome. It's not stopping us from building partnerships with all of the critical infrastructure sectors.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the panel discussion. I think working together is key, as it has been said. And the question I have is, how do we work together to be effective if not everybody is sitting on such panels? Like, I'm thinking about countries in Africa or in Latin America or in the Middle East. If we're not working together, or if we don't have them sitting on such panels, how can we eliminate those safe havens that were mentioned during this discussion? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd start with the point of, while we're here for 4 on the stage, 37 nations have come together around ransomware because it is a scourge against all of us. And the intent for that is to have everybody inside the circle and in a trusted way able to do it. There's a number of activities that bring us together, to the timeliness of reporting. There's the CERT-to-CERT relationships where we all have computer emergency response teams that have those international connectivities when we see something to say something. And there's also, the very focused gatherings where we work on things like ransomware and others. And then finally, from the U.S. standpoint, NSA has something called the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, which is explicitly designed to take our classified intelligence, get it down to operationalizing details, to details that could be used at an unclassified level. And we work with the biggest companies across the internet. And so we inject into them the ability to understand threats and to address those threats. And what they do is they put that shield around all of us, everybody in this room, all the nations around the globe, everybody who operates on those big hyperscale platforms, those major technologies and other things. And across all of us, I'm speaking right now, taking a little liberty, but I think, NCSC was out there first with their Industry 100 doing similar things, right? Both Australia and Canada do the same, where it's not always visible. We've got a little bit of the iceberg poking out of the water. The things underneath are often what matters and what have the biggest impact. And I would say the ability for us to see a threat and then get it out into that industrial community. Sometimes it's not on a big advisory with logos and seals. Sometimes it is direct into the company and then they just deal with it, right? That's helping the whole ecosystem. Team, anything else you would add to that?
The one thing I would add is everything that you said, Rob, is absolutely bang on. I would say that from a government perspective, there are international programs for capacity building also, where many of our government will offer outreach to other nations to say, how can we help you, raise the cybersecurity of your society? So everything from the tactical sort of incident response, CERT to CERT, to government, nation-to-nation programs.
All right, outstanding. Thanks for all your attention today. Please join me in a round of applause